We're live. Hang on, everybody. The computer is not next to the drawing board. There we go. Welcome to another live stream. Today, we're going to draw something just like last time. Although it's going to be something different from last time. As you can see, we've got a female figure reference. Gianni Drawing from Italy. Hello and welcome. Let's see here. Hang on, I gotta check real quick and make sure my camera is lined up properly. So, as you can see, it is not totally aligned. There we go, that's better. Sorry. Make sure everybody's seeing the board accurately. So, much like last week, we're just going to do a nice figure drawing. Actually, I guess I did a head drawing last week. Usually, to start out, I kind of show like some stuff I drew over the past week, but I don't actually have much because I've been taking some time off. Been spending a lot of time writing, actually, and creating a big workbook for these new drawing programs that are coming out. But I did draw one thing that I have in here somewhere, which I just posted on Instagram yesterday, so you may have seen it, but it looks like this. I just drew this for practice, basically. I'm not teaching any classes at the moment, but I don't know, I gotta keep my skills up somehow, you know, so I've been trying to draw something every day. And for me, like if I'm not working, it's hard to make myself draw. I don't know why, but that's just kind of how it's always been. But I'm a lot better at it now than I used to be. So this is something I just drew for practice. And I don't know, just grabbed a piece of reference and drew it. Not that anybody cares, I don't know. Yeah, mostly I got to keep my skills up because I got a workshop coming up in Germany. And since I'm not going to be teaching a bunch of classes anytime soon, I want to make sure that when I get to Germany, I still know how to draw because it is a skill that disappears fast. You know, I mean, if you take time off and stop drawing, you get rusty really quick, surprisingly quick. It's a little bit disturbing, to be honest. There's times where like I just take a few weeks off and it's like, oh my God, my arm doesn't work anymore. Okay, so let's try and draw something. Actually, before we draw something, I'm gonna open up this delicious can of Coke and drink some of it. So yes, I hope you have your Coca-Cola ready. And I like the idea of using it as a handy cylinder reference. I haven't done that yet, but it could come in handy. Although I'd have to make sure that like I actually drink it first, otherwise I'm gonna spill Coke everywhere. So this other thing that I drew, because people always ask me, like the way I start my drawings is I usually draw like a mark for where the top of the head will go, mark where the bottom of the foot will go, find the halfway point. Like it's really methodical, right? People always ask like, do you have to do that every time? And the answer is no, you don't have to. This thing that I drew, I didn't do that at all. I just like kind of blocked in a rough little shape real quick and then just drew it, you know? So like I didn't follow that whole procedure. But that's because, whoa, excuse me, I've been doing this for a long time, you know? And so when you're kind of like, I don't know, starting out, it's good to have an actual procedure to follow that'll kind of get you on the right track and get things placed properly. So that's kind of what we're going to work on. We'll go in here and just kind of place like, say, here's the top of the head, right? And figure out how do we want this figure to fit on the page, right? So if we're going to have the top of the head here, bottom of the foot, we'll go, let's say here. I could zoom out more, but I don't want to zoom out too much. I want this to fit on the screen. Oh, also, there's lights in the way. That's not good. There we go. That's fine. I'm going to zoom in a little bit.
Do you want me to adjust it from back here?
No, there's no room. It has to be there.
Right in front of the camera. It's okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
It can't. It has to block some of it. I can't zoom out
Okay,
that
go
far.
ahead.
It
It's
always
out of
does
the
that.
shot now.
Yeah, because I zoomed in more.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So the foot, we're going to make it right about here. And that should fit pretty well. Right, so we basically got a top point, bottom, and then we'll find like a halfway point. And since somebody always asks, the answer is no, you don't always have to do this. I do it a lot because I'm teaching, and I'm pretty much always teaching a class because that's what I do. But you can see I'm just kind of looking for that halfway point. Looks pretty good. But notice I took a guess first, just took my best guess, measured it, and thought, oh, it needs to move up a little bit, and moved it up, and then that was about right. I've been doing this a long time, and I still find it hard to guess exactly where that halfway point is accurately. It's not easy. Right, so we've got like a little bit of a guide down here. We've got top of the head, bottom of the foot, and the exact halfway point between these two things. And so I'm just going to lean over here now, and to my reference photo, which I have on a laptop sitting over here, I'm going to figure out where that halfway point is on her, right? From the very bottom of the toes is to the top of the head. The halfway point is roughly almost kind of like where the pubic bone would be. Or just below it maybe is about the halfway point, right? So that tells me automatically that this entire space here is leg, right? So that's basically going to be leg plus foot, right? And part of the reason that seems unusually high for the halfway point, although it's not that much higher, but usually it would be roughly for a standing pose, like between the heel and the top of the head, the halfway point would be about the pubic bone. In this case, it's a little bit lower than that because her foot is like tilted down, right? Like she's like taking her foot and like kind of like, boop, like turning it, I guess that's a good way to put it, doing that, right? And so it's kind of increasing that distance a bit. So we know where the halfway point is. So now I'm just going to measure how many heads down to that halfway point, right? So I'm going to lean over here again and go, well, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, roughly about 4 heads down to that halfway point. So again, take a bit of a guess and double check my guess. Got 1, 2, 3, 4. That could be a little bit bigger maybe. 1, 2, 4. Seems pretty good. So I think that'll be a pretty good head size. Now, it's a fairly upright pose, right? Like it's fairly straight up and down. Her head is kind of near the middle. Like, so we can put her head in the middle of the page and that pose should fit just fine. But if she had like one arm out to the side or a leg out to the side or something, you know, then we would have to do like maybe a side to side halfway point as well. And then figure out kind of where the head would go from side to side. Because we don't want the foot or arm or whatever to go off the side of the page. But in this case, I don't think it's going to matter a whole lot because it's all pretty upright, you know. So her head's going to fit up in here, which right now, maybe that's fine. It feels a little bit large, to be honest, considering that the entire torso has to fit in this space. Maybe it's fine. We'll go with it. That was kind of what the measurement said, so we'll start with it. But keep in mind that these measurements, they're not like 100% accurate. They're just to kind of get us in the ballpark, get things going, and get us something to start with. You know, they're not something that we have to be totally reliant on. They're just, part of what's hard about drawing is just getting something down on the page. I mean, that's like one of the hardest parts is just starting. Like when you're staring at a blank page, it's kind of intimidating, especially if you're new and you don't really know exactly what to be doing, then it can be tough. And so those quick little measurements will get something on the page and kind of give you a little bit of a hint as to what we need to be doing. All right, so I'm going to create a head shape here. That will hopefully match her head to some extent. All right, probably something like that. We can zoom in here a little bit. Get rid of our construction lines here. And she's got a little bit of a tilt going on to her head, so we can tilt that center line a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. And we don't need to draw too much of the head yet, right? We want to keep things very simple right now. So her neck is tough. So her head's kind of turned back towards us, but her torso is kind of off to the side, like kind of turned this way, right? So we're going to have to figure out how to create a neck shape that sort of accounts for that. And so for the neck, we're going to start with two C curves, right? And it's going to kind of go like this way. This one's going to kind of come in this way. And then from there, you can see the trapezius starts just below chin level and kind of goes off this direction. And then what's tricky here is the pit of the neck is way over here, right? So we're seeing the pit of the neck basically over this way, which means sternocleidomastoid now is going over this direction. Right, kind of sitting up under there. Right, get a little bit of that neck shape on there. And let's see, collarbone. Right, kind of coming back up this way. And then we get shoulder, pop it up this direction. And we got to make sure we're seeing just the right amount of trapezius in here. All right, so let's see if we can find how much of that. I think we need just a little bit more. Say shoulder is going to sit around this angle. Right, we get collarbone cutting across here. Kind of pops up a little bit, down, sits right about in there. Right, kind of like that. And then over here we got her other shoulder, but you know, since she's turned to the side, we're not seeing much of the collarbone. The collarbone is kind of like wrapping around the side here. Right, so we're only seeing a little bit of it, and then the shoulder is kind of coming up this direction. And then the gesture is kind of going up this way for the arm. You know, this little bit of collarbone we're seeing is wrapping around the corner and kind of disappearing around the other side. This isn't bad. To be honest, I don't like the neck gesture. I'm kind of regretting it a little bit. I feel like it needs to go the other way. I feel like those two C curves I put down should have gone the other direction. I think that's going to work better. Yeah, that works much better. right? With those two C curves, we're trying to figure out the gesture of the neck, right? And just a nice sweep, and then we go in and build on top of them and figure out how to modify and change them to get exactly what we need. Which in this case, I think will look about like that. So I think that's a good start, right? That's a good kind of like little head, neck, and shoulder section. And from there, we can kind of move on. And things are going to get a little trickier, right? So we've got the gesture for the torso, which in this case comes out pretty far, right? Like, so if we're looking at a center line here for the torso, it's going to start kind of like up here at the clavicle, right? Just got a little crazy on me. Right, it's going to start up here at the clavicle, or like at the pit of the neck, I guess, specifically, I should say. And then it's going to end at the pubic bone, right? Which, I mean, it's kind of censored, so you guys can't see it exactly, but that's basically underneath, just behind the pit of the neck a little bit, and just above our halfway point here. So it's going to end right about here. Right, so we're going to have this part come out, essentially wrap around, kind of like that. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can do gesture. We could carry this right down into the leg, right? I mean, I could like kind of zoom back out and say like, well, the gesture here is going to maybe continue all the way down into this leg and foot. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. If we were working more like Riley method, that's more how I would do it. But lately I've been going for a much more like constructive type method. Right, so what I'm going to look for instead is just a nice gesture for the torso. Right, just for the entire torso. This kind of is going to come down this direction, kind of next to here. And then on this side, it's going to kind of cut in this way. Right, and then kind of back out this way.
Got a question to read you.
Okay.
And I don't have the mic on, but I'm just going to read it anyways.
Okay.
So this is from Constantinus, who says, when dealing with an entire pose, should I quickly lay out the entire silhouette of the reference image, or of the image pose, or should I focus first on the torso?
Either one, to be honest. I mean, so the question was, in case you couldn't hear Olivia, like if you're dealing with the whole pose, should you quickly lay out the entire silhouette or focus on the torso? I would say either one is fine, whichever one you're more comfortable with, right? Because like right now, this is, the way I'm drawing this is a pretty specific method that's kind of geared more towards learning maybe in terms of like top, bottom, halfway, and it's kind of how I was taught. But like, as you can see, like I'm basically creating the silhouette, but I'm just doing it piece by piece, and then I'm going to go back and build on top of it. But when I drew this one that I just showed a little while ago, that I drew the other day, oh wait, no, not that one, hang on. I don't know where it went. Oh, this one, right? This one, like I went more with like the, kind of like a big shape for the whole thing, right? And I didn't really bother to measure and do all that stuff. I just drew it. So really, it comes down to whatever you're comfortable with, right? But you'll notice when we do the gesture phase, what we're trying to work on is to create that big silhouette, you know? So I would say that's kind of what we're doing. It's just a matter of what order you want to do it in and, you know, it doesn't really matter in the end. All that really matters is your, you know, what you end up with, kind of the final result is the important part. So from here, we could keep going, right? I could keep coming in here and saying like, well, now we've got this gesture coming down this way, and right, this is going to come down that direction. We could say now our leg is going to come out this way. Right, a little bit like that. Arm is going to be up here. You know, so we could take the gesture really far. And to me, this is the silhouette. Like, it doesn't have to, but it doesn't have to be drawn this way necessarily if you don't want to do it this way. You could do it more in like a, I don't know, like blockier type shape where you kind of work it out more with straights. I mean, there's just so many different ways you could do it. Right, we've got the hand on there. Right, her arm kind of comes up this way and then shoots back kind of this direction. You know, a little bit like that. So that essentially would be our silhouette, right? Because it's during this gesture phase where we're trying to establish where it sits on the page. We're just trying to establish length and width of certain things, right? Like what is the width of the knee, the ankle, what's the width of the elbow, the wrist. I work out all of that in the gesture phase, in the actual placement of things, you know, and, you know, then we can come in here and say, okay, we know there's a rib cage in here. So we can come in here and add some more stuff. Right, we know there's a rib cage in here, kind of sitting at a bit of an angle. Right, about like that. We know that we have kind of a boxy shape for the hip, which in this case is also, it's like kind of tilted a little bit. Kind of sitting in here, I think like this. You know, and this is going to help make sure that all the three-dimensional aspects of the drawing are working properly. You know, if we can't figure out how this box sits in here, it's going to be really tough to figure out exactly if we're seeing enough of the side plane of the torso or are we seeing the front, right? What we're basically trying to establish is what is the width of the pelvis, right? What is the width of the front of the pelvis? What is the width of the side of the pelvis? And then its orientation. How far is it turned? Is it angled back? You know, there's like a number of things that we're trying to establish. And at least in my experience so far, I've had pretty good luck with the whole like using the box for the pelvis or pelvic section or hip or whatever you want to call it. But there are way more, there's so many different ways to draw this area, right? And there's way more complex ways of doing it. And, you know, I don't want to make it sound like this is the only way, because that's not the case. And this to me is the easiest way, especially for like newer students, right? Because there's more complex shapes. There's like all sorts of like pelvis shapes that I see people use. There's like almost like kind of like underwear type shapes that like three-dimensionally that people draw for this area. All of those work. In fact, they might even work better than the box, but they're way more difficult to make work. You know, they're much more challenging. And so for me, if, you know, as an instructor where I'm training a lot of people, the box and just being able to manipulate a box and an oval, I mean, that's like a core concept. You know, like if you're having trouble with that, then trying to draw a more complex pelvis shape three-dimensionally is going to be really challenging. Like it's not an easy thing to draw by any means. You know, so essentially that would be the beginning of structure, right? So we had our gesture, now we're going to layer some structure on top of here. And, you know, kind of figure out what's going on with these arms. You know, these are going to be kind of more cylindrical type forms, kind of going away from us quite a bit. You know, and then we've got this part kind of coming back towards us. You know, so like at first glance, this arm, it looks kind of small, but then you realize like, oh, wait a minute, it's not really small. It's actually like angled away from us. You know, so trying to understand, again, three-dimensionally, what is going on with these cylinders and blocks. And this is actually a cylinder angled away from us. You know, so like the importance of basic shapes, I mean, they're just absolutely critical to successful drawing of any type. Well, assuming you want to be like a representational type artist. I don't know about like, I don't know, abstract art or something, I guess would be different. And, right, so then we've got this arm, which is more or less not, it's like M profile, right? Like I think the forearm is coming out towards us a little bit, but this part is maybe leaned away from us just slightly, but I don't even really know if that's the case, to be honest. But I'm going to push it that way a little bit just for the sake of it not being totally flat. Right, and then this forearm is coming down this way, and that's kind of coming out towards us a little bit. Not a lot, just a little bit. Right, wrist is kind of sitting up in here. Right, a little bit of like a blocky shape for the wrist. You know, the hand's kind of being tilted back up that way. You know, hand's kind of sitting up in here on her side. You know, so once we start getting that, once we have the gesture established, then we can start layering some structure on top of it, right? And so we can come in here and look for kind of like where the pec is going to sit. Kind of how that's going to connect and interact with the shoulder. right? Kind of like that. All right, we can add the breasts. Sitting over here, kind of like this. Notice I'm just kind of starting with ovals, but the breasts are not actually ovals, right? Like what I'm doing right now is more about placement and just kind of getting them in the right spot and making sure they're, taking up the right space. They're tilted properly, which right now doesn't actually seem correct. I'll move this one up a little bit, right? So we'll kind of move them around as ovals, and then when we get them where they need to be, then we can go in and modify them and change them accordingly. Right, so when drawing the breast, there's kind of a counterintuitive thing to keep in mind, which is that it's good to find somewhere to push a straight within that shape for the breast, which you don't typically think of them as having straight lines, but it'll make them feel like they have gravity affecting them a little bit more. And it doesn't always work either, but you should try and find a place to do it if you can. Because like when gravity pulls on something, it kind of tends to like straighten it out. And then from here we have rib cage kind of dropping down this way a little bit. That rib cage kind of drops back in. Notice that follows right along where that oval went, and then from there we can kind of figure out where the abs are going to sit. Which are basically right up in here, right? So if we have the rib cage opening up here, kind of like way up in here, then those abs are going to kind of drop right down into this space. Which now, she's not like a bodybuilder or anything, so we can't make them, we don't want to go in and work out every single ab, but they're basically going to drop into that space, and then it seems like we're seeing a little bit of the oblique, kind of like right in here. Right in here, and then that oblique is kind of cutting inward. And then we get some of that like inguinal ligament type area. Rib cage opening. Now, we're not going to go in and draw all of the oblique and abs. I'm going to leave it mostly open right here, because again, like things need to be relatively subtle, and we need to not overdo the anatomy in order to get her type correct. I do think the pelvis could be a little bit wider. sit something about like that. And then from there we can keep going, right? Move down to the legs and start looking for maybe like a refined gesture for the leg, right? Because this was just kind of like a quick loose type gesture. I feel like right now this foot should move out a little bit farther probably. So if I draw a quick plumb line, the ankle roughly sits outside of this elbow here, right? So if we draw a line kind of down from the elbow, that tells me the ankle and foot need to shift over this way a little bit. So we can kind of reverse engineer it, right? I can say like, well, I know the toes need to be sitting around here. And so our foot is going to need to be like in here. Right about there, right? So you can see the initial gesture that I threw down, not perfect. It wasn't terrible, right? And so we'll come in here and see if we can figure out how to create a better gesture that kind of links into this foot, right? Now that we have the foot kind of placed where it needs to be. And then we'll come in here and add the hip on here, right? Coming out this direction. Right, a little bit like that. And then we can come in here and look for the rest of the gesture for this leg. It's going to be roughly about like that. So I use gesture in a very specific way that I don't, well, yeah, I don't know, a very specific way of doing it. And what I'm looking for essentially with the gesture is I'm trying to establish the length and overall placement of things, right? Where's the hip, where's the foot? What's the gesture between the two, right? Like gesture, when I was a student, I was always told like it's the movement between the forms, right? So what's the movement between the hip up in here section and the foot in this case? You know, if her leg was bent like this one, then it would be the movement between the hip and the knee, and then again the knee and the foot. And then if we had I don't know. But what I'm trying to do also is establish that, but then also establish the width at key points, right? So what is the width up here at the connection point of the leg? What is the width of the knee? What is the width of the ankle? And then I can take my gesture lines and kind of constrain them to those widths, right? So we're not just establishing length and movement, we're also establishing length and width at the same time. You know, and then I can come in here and say, well, now I know the knee kind of sits roughly about here, you know, and kind of figure out like, okay, where's that knee going to go? Same thing on this one, right? We're going to come in here and say, well, we've got this leg coming out this way, right? And then we hit the knee out here. Right, kind of coming back this way. And then she's got her leg kind of like down into the chair a little bit, right? Because there's like a cushion on the chair that her leg's kind of disappearing under. So we just kind of have to imagine real quick, like, okay, where's the rest of that gesture? It's kind of coming out this way. And then we get the foot kind of coming out that direction. And so we can, once again, look for kind of like length and width. You know, we see the heel for the foot up in here. And that foot disappears in the shadow. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on there. Man, it's really in shadow. It's just like gone. Also the terrible screen I have on my laptop isn't helping at all. But it's basically in here somewhere, right? So we've got this foot kind of coming back this way. I think maybe, oh, that's not good. Probably going back this direction, I think is what's happening. Kind of like disappearing back underneath there. And this entire leg is basically in profile, right? So there's not a lot of like structure necessarily in the sense that, you know, we can find like really clear cylindrical forms or anything. We can push it a little bit, but generally speaking, I don't think there's a lot of that going on. But this one there is, right? This one, I mean, this one's kind of in profile also, but here I'd say we're kind of like looking up at her a little bit here. Right, and then at the knee, we're kind of like starting to look down at that part a little bit more. You know, and then as we work our way down, we're looking down at this leg more and more until eventually we hit the ankle. It's going to be like right in here. So I think that's looking pretty good. Before we go too much farther, I want to get a little bit of the chair in here, right? Because it's such a critical part. Like right now, it looks a little bit strange because she's just floating in a weird way, right? Like it doesn't really make sense. She's going to either fall over or we have to draw something for her to lean on. And so what I'm going to look for here is kind of where this chair is sitting. She's basically like this. And then keep in mind her leg is disappearing down into the chair. You know, kind of getting squished down into there. So we need to make sure this works properly and makes sense. It's relatively level. Right, we don't have to draw a ton, we just got to draw enough that it looks like she's leaning on something. I mean, if you have time, obviously you should draw the whole thing because that would make the most sense. But at the very least, we want to make sure it just doesn't look like she's floating. It's a very bad habit and one that I suffer from. So believe me, I know what happens if we don't take the time to draw stuff for her to be leaning on. Right down here, we could make this the ground. That's totally possible. It could also be the box that her foot is on. Either way is fine. There doesn't have to be a box there. I think this would make sense without the box. It's mostly the stool here that she needs to be leaning on, I think is important. Right, so from there we can come in and start to add more stuff, right? And I'll come in here and kind of lighten this a little bit. And I'm going to use my hand to do that unless something's really dark, but also my eraser is leaving marks on the paper. That's never a good sign. So at this point, we'll come in and basically just do another pass, right? And take these basic cylindrical gestural forms and start to add a little bit of anatomy and start to figure out kind of how our overlaps are going to work, such as bicep, right? And then we get a bunch of compression right in here where the forearm and the upper arm are kind of compressed up against one another, right? So it's going to pick up like a little bit of like a straight almost where they get compressed. Right, notice I put a straight back here, right? And the reason for that was because I wanted to, oh, that wasn't very good, because I wanted to kind of specify where the bone is sitting, right? And once we know where the bone sits, then we can come in and kind of build off of it and start to add some of the forearm muscles, right? Which in this case would be flexors. You know, and this is where anatomy knowledge comes in. And, you know, when I teach anatomy classes, we start out learning all of the anatomy, but then by the end, it's really more about how to use that information strategically, right? And how to kind of pick and choose what information you need to use. Because you don't want to use all of the anatomy all the time. I mean, I guess you do if you're drawing like the Hulk or like Wolverine or something. But that's usually not the case, unless you're a comic book artist that's drawing the Hulk. In which case you probably do want to use a lot of the anatomy. Right, but there's little key things, right? Like we have the olecranon sticking out here. I kind of know how the flexors and the ulna work out here. You know, I'm kind of using that to guide what it is that I'm drawing. And it's helpful for sure. You know, I mean, anatomy is really important. Right, we get a little bit of the pec and deltoid up there maybe. Right, over on this side we've got deltoid. Right, a little bit of like tricep or something, but honestly, again, she's not like a bodybuilder, so it's not like this is gonna be like a gigantic arm. Everything's gonna be really subtle. We don't have to put in very much. Right, we get some compression up in here. And then we get some of the bicep. Kind of dropping down this way. Kind of cuts in a little bit. We hit our elbow again, which is the ulna. Right, kind of going up around that way. And then we're going to get the ridge muscles, and they specifically are kind of coming in this direction from the side of the arm. But then her wrist is pronated, so they're also being twisted quite a bit. So they're kind of doing this. Right, and then we're seeing the ulna actually go up this direction here, right? And then the flexors kind of hang down below it. And they're actually coming out this way. Right, sitting right down around there. But notice we're not going in and drawing every single flexor or every single ridge muscle, right? It's just little key parts. And the reason we need to know them all is because they guide the overlaps, right? And the overlaps are what help create depth. So understanding how the overlaps are working right in this area is really critical, right? Same thing. Why do we have a little overlap right in here, right? And I know it's because that's where the head of the humerus sits. And then we get the ulna kind of wrapping back up behind it. I know that the ulna then kind of goes up this direction, and then our flexors drop down from below it. So even though we're not going in and drawing every single muscle, knowing that anatomy is key, right? Like we've got all these little overlaps created by that anatomy. It would be really challenging to draw that without it. Okay, let's see. We've got a little bit of the lat coming in this way, and then we're getting some compression out here. Right, kind of like that, a little bit of compression happening. And then we've got the oblique and hip connecting out that way. And again, it's basically connecting to this box that we just drew, right? It should just grab onto it. Depending on the person, sometimes I wrap it this way, sometimes I wrap it this way. Totally depends on the person and the body type. In this case, I feel like it just seems way more accurate to wrap the oblique around the pelvis this direction. We can even see a little bit of the oblique in here, kind of wrapping around this way a little bit. You know, kind of like sitting right up in there. And there's like tendon going on that way, but again, we can't see that much of that on her. You know, for the most part, I would keep my lines relatively round, except for the areas where there's specific reasons to use straights, right? Like in the joints, in the bony areas. You know, so that brings us down to the leg, which is going to be a little bit trickier, right? So again, we've got to think about our leg anatomy a little bit. We're going to have the sartorius coming from our aces point right up in here, right? And that's going to basically drop down this direction and kind of disappear back behind the medialis, and we're picking up a little bit of bone. It looks like kind of sticking out roughly about there maybe. So I think the knee, that little mark that I made for the knee earlier, could probably move up a little bit. Right, and if we built our gesture just right, we should be able to build around it and on it and not necessarily have to go back and change it a whole bunch. Right, so it'll sit in there about like that. On this part, we've got, you know, again, kind of glute and hip kind of out this way, and then it's kind of dropping back in this direction. And then we've got bone, right? So we've got the tibia, right? Kind of like right up in here, which means the head of the fibula has to sit on this side. And we should hopefully be able to get our calf coming out on this direction, or on this side over here. And right now this feels a little bit long. I think I'm going to end up moving the ankle up just a little bit. we'll know here in a minute. Yeah, I'm going to move this ankle up a bit, right? Because if we look at this whole thing, this section down here just feels long. Like this part specifically feels long compared to everything else. And the foot actually feels a little bit small. So I think if we just move the ankle up a little bit, also get a different eraser so I'm not leaving marks on the paper. Right, and then say, let's move this ankle up maybe to about there. Right, and that gives us way more room here for the foot. Which I don't know, even know that we need it necessarily. Right, like we maybe just need to move the bottom part up entirely. You know, but don't be afraid to change things. That's a big part of this, is making sure that things are kind of changeable and movable and keeping our marks kind of nice and light. Because you might need to change them. I mean, it's just the way it works a lot of the time. You know, we get a little bit of like heel maybe poking out on the side. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on with that foot. Just kind of stay back from it and look at the whole thing if I can. See if I can get it to read just the way I want it to. You know, but it's tough. I mean, one of the things that I used to hit all the time as a student was it's very easy to work on an area like this that's really small and you get really focused in on this one little area and you draw a pretty good foot and then you get back from it and you realize like, oh, dang, the whole thing's way too small or too big. You know, like it doesn't match the rest of the drawing. So you got to constantly like kind of like lean back and try and look at the whole thing and see if you can figure out how it reads. I mean, if you're working digitally, you can just like zoom out real quick, or you can flip it maybe. I don't know. All those little digital things that people do. I think that's looking pretty good. It's not bad. That leg might be a little bit long, but I think it reads okay. Right, and then from here we'll go in and look for this other leg. Which there's not much to it, to be honest. It's like almost done at this point. Very gestural leg type shape. You know, I think we can add a little bit more, a little bit of glute, and then a little bit more hamstring here. And then it just makes a nice curve this way, and then it kind of pops back out a little bit. Right, a little bit like that. And then we have the foot, leg coming out from here. Just looking for a nice curve for the top of the leg, right? Kind of drops down here into the knee. Remember, C curves, S curves, and straights are really the key to a lot of this. You know, like those are basically the marks that I'm making. If you watch the way that I move my arm, my hand, I don't really make any marks other than that. I mean, it sounds like it's being like I'm kind of like oversimplifying things, but that's the truth is that's it. I mean, those are the marks. You know, if you look at every single mark on here, C curve, C curve, C curve, kind of into an S curve, and then a little tiny straight. You know, a little C curve right there, a little bit of an S curve, C curve. Like it's basically just taking those three types of marks and finding interesting ways to combine them. And it ends up looking much more controlled and dynamic. Also, I think I made this leg a little bit big. Pull this in a little bit here. I think that's better. Which means I need to pull this back a little bit. Again, if something doesn't look right, don't be afraid to change it. So it's looking pretty good. So we definitely have a lot of compression kind of like up in this area, right? Because the leg's being squished together, right? So what we're getting is the muscle on the bottom of the leg and the calf, on the side of the leg, it's all being squished and like compressed outward towards us, you know, and so we're kind of picking up this area right in here, you know, where it's actually kind of like squished. It's kind of going like this and then like that. I should zoom in there a little bit. You know, and then this part's kind of coming out that way. So it's just something to think about, right? Again, those three-dimensional forms. Are key, and it all starts with studying basic shapes, right? How well can you draw a cylinder, a box, sphere? It's looking pretty good. So let's see if we can get a little bit more of a head indication on here. And we'll try and throw some shadows on here real quick, if we can. Sorry, I gotta scoot back a little bit. There we go. Okay, so her hairline's pretty far up here, probably right up around there. Probably because we're looking up at her a little bit, but then her head is also tilted down a little bit, right? So it's kind of creating a situation where the hairline is almost like we're looking right at her instead of up at her. Right? And then we can kind of find those thirds, which will be roughly about like that. Right, see if we can maintain that tilt. Might want to measure these real quick, make sure they're pretty close. It's kind of close. Move that one down a little bit. That's pretty good. You know, and then we can kind of start thinking more about like, okay, where's the side plane of the head? Kind of sitting over here. We're seeing a little bit of side plane over here probably. You know, and so like we're actually seeing a little bit of that kind of like side plane off over here, right? Her jaw, roughly right around here. You know, chin. Her ear, since we're looking up at her quite a bit, her ear is kind of low. Right, so her ear is like kind of like back here. Right, maybe right about there. And then she has a pretty unique brow shape. Which I'm not going to take the time to draw her whole head because it would take a little while. I want to get enough of it blocked in that I kind of know what's going on. You know, her eyebrow goes way up here. You know, it sits like way up there. She has very high arcing eyebrows, but part of that isn't just the eyebrows, because of her actual brow bone goes way up. Okay, again, I don't want to draw her whole head. What I'm really trying to get at here is the hair, right? So she's got bangs coming down to roughly about this level right here. You know, so we got to figure out what are those doing, what do they look like? They're kind of coming out this way, wrapping around. And then over here, they're kind of coming out the other way. Kind of doing that. Right, then we get the side of the head. Bangs are kind of coming, her hair's coming down this direction, and then we get a little bit of like sideburn. Probably pull this in a little bit. right? And then we get the top of her hair kind of starting here. Pops up a little bit. Cuts over. This way. And we need to capture a shape kind of dropping way down into here, right? So that's going to basically be coming from behind her head here, kind of overlapping her shoulder. Notice I'm not drawing exactly what I'm seeing in the reference, right? Like I'm trying to like simplify it a little bit and make it a little bit more simplified. A little bit of a redundant description, but trying to draw hair exactly as you see it is pretty complicated. Not that it can't be done, but it's just art. It takes a lot of time. I would say I don't typically have that much time. All right, so we have some hair kind of coming through there. And then over on this side, we're getting hair coming out this way. Right, kind of coming down that direction and then out this way. Oh, dropped it. Something interesting and fascinating. Constantinus wrote, I have the Jeff Watts book that is his female studies book. He did a diagram redraw where the shoulders curve near the inside of the boob. The shoulders curve near the inside of the boob. Not exactly sure what that refers to. It could be this part maybe. But to me that sounds like something that would change a lot depending on the pose. But I don't know exactly what that's referring to. Hate to admit it, but I don't actually have that book. Anyway, just find some like little simplified hair shapes if we can. I started getting a little too crazy. I wanted to take that back out, but you can see if you draw it too dark, it can be a problem. And then you're kind of stuck with it, unfortunately. It happens sometimes. Okay, so before we move on, I'm going to do one more thing here, which is I want to back all the way out and look at what the head size looks like in comparison to the rest of the drawing. Looks a little bit small, just a little bit. I think maybe it's okay, but we can make it maybe a little bit bigger. Also, I don't like how complicated this got. I feel like we can simplify this down as well. But how is the question? I think that's pretty good. Much more simple, easier to follow. It's very easy to let things get too complicated. Happens to me all the time. Okay, so let's see if we can get some shadows on here, right? So we kind of lightened this already a little bit, and then I sort of got caught up in the head, unfortunately. That wasn't my plan, but it did happen. So we've got, let's throw a little bit of shadow on the nose real quick. I'm not going to draw her entire head because it would just take too long. I'll be honest, like I'm not the fastest head drawer. But I can throw a quick shadow on here. Right, we get a little bit of shadow off the nose. Got a little bit over here on the cheek. A little bit along the chin. And it basically follows right back up around here. And then we get a cast shadow down below. It's going to drop down this way, cross this direction, and kind of pops back up and over. Robert Alexander, totally subscribed. This is great. That's cool. I'm glad you like it. Okay, that's enough of the head. I mean, I could spend a lot of time on the head, to be honest, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. I just realized there's also a little bit of her other ears showing. Right in here. Not that you have to have it on there, but might be good. A little bit of an ear shape. Ear shadow shape specifically. Kind of like right up in there. Which again, knowing that ear anatomy is critical, right? Because if you look at what I drew, is it an exact copy? No, but I'm guided by my understanding of that ear anatomy. I know kind of where the helix goes, where the anti-helix goes. I know where the tragus is going to sit. I know where that little notch is going to sit, where the lobe is going to sit. And we'll move on from the face. That's probably enough. Although there is some shadow on her hair that might be good to get on there. Right? There's a little bit like on her hair. And then it kind of wraps down around this way. It gets nice and soft up in the hair. Right, as we work our way down, we've got a little bit of a cast shadow from her head onto her shoulder here, and it's kind of hitting this little bit of collarbone, and then kind of popping out this direction, and then back up this way. Right, a little bit of cast shadow right up in there, and then we get a little bit of shadow on the pec, right in here, just a little bit. And then it kind of pops back up a little bit where we get a little bit of like indication for maybe teres major, a little bit of the lat or something kind of poking up in there. You know, and then we have shadow along the bottom of this arm. Now this piece of reference, I'll be honest, it doesn't have the best shadows, but it's okay. It's good enough that I think we can create something interesting from it. And what we want to focus on is edges, right? Shape and edge at this point. I don't want to get into value yet. I'm just going to do some shadow mapping. I don't want to go in here and render everything right now. But the mapping lets us focus on those two things, right? Shape and edge. So we're establishing our hard edges, our soft edges. And then we're also focusing on the shapes of those shadows. You know, and it lets us really focus on shape design and figure out like exactly what these things should be looking like. Celsius wrote, I have a question about pencils. Do you get packs of Wolf's Carbon or can you order a lot of 6B pencils? I order a whole box of 6B pencils. And I don't know, do I have that sitting here? Basically, what I end up doing is, I don't think they're any cheaper necessarily, but they come in packs of like 12 maybe, I think. So like if you just order 12 at once, they just show up in a big box of all 12. That's how I buy them. They're not cheap. I don't know what the deal is with pencils, but man, pencil prices have gone crazy. But I guess prices on everything have gone crazy. It's not just pencils. But these Wolf Carbons, man, they are not as cost effective as they used to be. Or the Contes, any of these. The charcoal pencils, I don't know why, they just got really expensive all of a sudden. Right, we get a little bit of shadow along the breast. Again, very soft edge, right? Because it's a rounded form. So we need a nice soft edge to describe a rounded form. Come in here, soften this quite a bit. And then we get a little bit of a cast shadow kind of coming down underneath it and sort of like wrapping around the rib cage down here. Same thing over here, we get a shadow. See if I can get this shape on here a little better first. Right, and then we'll get a cast shadow, or not a cast shadow, sorry, form shadow first. Up along the breast here. And it kind of gets pulled tight back around here. So it's going to be less soft here, more soft out here, right? So we want variation to our edges. right? We need to go in here and find how to describe that form, which is more rounded here, and then it turns more quickly out here, right? So if the form turns slower, we get a softer edge. If it turns faster, we get a harder edge, you know, and then we have a cast shadow underneath here, which in this case is going to be a very crisp, hard edge out this way, and then it's going to be a little bit of a softer edge out this direction, right? So with the way cast shadows work, they start out as very hard edges up near the object that's casting them, and then as the cast shadow moves farther away from that object, it's going to soften up. But in this case, that edge, or the shadow is not going very far, so it's not going to get like too soft. But I'm going to exaggerate that softness a little bit just to help kind of increase the depth in the drawing, you know, and kind of really push it a little bit. You know, we've got a little bit of shadow on this arm up in here. Got some shadow up in the armpit, right along the pec, right along pectoralis. Picking up a little bit. It's going to be a fairly soft edge. Pencils, Jesse. I use those pencils almost always. They're pretty good pencils, but I don't know why. I don't know what's going on with art supplies in general are getting more expensive. I don't know what the deal is. Just get what I can afford, either online or local art store. About the same price. Yeah, that's what I've found. Like, although I will say sometimes when I look at them online, they seem crazy expensive, and you have to look around a little bit. There's definitely some people on there, I don't know, taking advantage of people, it seems like. At least on Amazon. Some really crazy prices sometimes for these pencils. Not liking this edge. So this needs to be relatively soft right in here, because it's, again, rounded form. And then we get a little cast shadow underneath here. Right, so we're going to get this part coming out and around. A little cast shadow kind of shooting out that direction and meeting up with that part. You know, and we want to tie our shadow shapes together as much as possible. You know, and try not to have anything kind of hanging out there on its own. Right, so we always want to draw complete shapes, right? That's the thing to remember, complete shapes. Because when it comes time to render, it's going to be really critical to getting things to read properly. Jesse also wrote, Brian, can you suggest who to study noses from? I've been working faces, and it's a huge problem area for me. Curious who you might reference. Vanderpool would be a big one. Vanderpool and Bridgman both. I know I always say the Bridgman heads are really weird and to not study them. For whatever reason, when Bridgman draws individual features, they're pretty good. And I studied those a lot. It's just when he draws a whole head, I don't know what the deal is. It gets weird. But certainly for noses, I would recommend a mix of Vanderpool and Bridgman. And I'm sure there's a ton of other good artists to study out there for noses. You know, in fact, I can see my Vanderpool book from here. Hang on, I'm going to try and grab it. Right, so if I was going to study noses, partly I'd look at the Bridgman book. Partly I would look at this book. And I would just work on kind of copying these noses. Right? Boom. The nose. Right? And like the reproductions on these aren't great, but you can see all the shapes really clearly. You know, and then he's got these little diagrams off to the side that are always pretty good. I would draw every single one of those. Except maybe that skull. You know, these two. Again, reproductions aren't great, but in a way that's almost good because it kind of challenges you to like clean them up and figure out how to make sense of them a little bit. But all of these are pretty awesome. You know, each of these. Boom, all of these. And I guess that was it for the nose section, but then you can see even in like the mouth section, there's a whole bunch more noses. I mean, they're just all over the place in here. There's one there. I would just copy the heck out of those. You know, here's more noses in the mouth section. Guessing there's probably not a lot of noses in the ear section. But this is the book that I would use for features the most. It's pretty good. It is The Human Figure by John H. Vanderpoel. And then for Bridgman, Bridgman is the one where I really studied the different like cartilages of the nose, which are really important. In fact, that's what I would really recommend is learn the cartilages because the way the cartilages of the nose connect, like the alar cartilage and the wing of the nostril, those are the things that create the shape of the opening of the nostril, like the opening to the nasal cavity, you know? And so if you learn how those cartilages work, then you have a much easier time drawing those little nose opening shapes, which I used to have a really, really hard time with until I spent some time studying those cartilages. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. It's not drawing that little opening shape so much as understanding the things around it that are creating it. And that really helped me quite a bit. Let's see if I can reach this other book. Let's see. So again, you can see kind of what I'm talking about, right? Like his heads, for some reason, when he draws a whole head, it looks a little weird. I don't know what's up with that. I would not study those. I never have. I don't recommend it. But if we keep going, skip all the big head shapes and get to facial features, which are in here somewhere. It's a big book. Like, what is going on with that? Don't copy that. I don't know what is up with that. Features, right? So we get into the chin. It's interesting, but again, I never drew any of those. The eye, right? Like he's got pretty good eye information. It's strange. He draws terrible heads, but then when he goes and draws these little individual eyes, they're quite good. You can see the planes of the lids. You can see all sorts of cool stuff in there. And they work pretty well. So like I've studied this stuff, his ear shapes. They're pretty cool. I would go more with Vanderpoel for ears. These are cool, but they're a little bit like abstract or something. I don't know. They're a little bit odd. But then this one's cool. These are cool ears, right? And then we get into the nose, right? He draws really cool noses, right? Like this is awesome. You can see all the little shapes, all the different planes. I mean, they're just like super clear. This, I drew this a ton of times, this whole page. All these little cartilages. I drew this one a bunch of times, but to be honest, I don't know how helpful that one was. But these other ones, super helpful, right? This nose, this one, each little part. Right? I mean, they really help me a lot. This and these two, I guess three specifically, are really good. You know, these are really cool. And once I kind of learned how those cartilages work, drawing noses became way easier. Let's see, comparisons. Oh, then you get into the mouth. He's pretty good with mouths also. So I don't know. Bridgman's a strange one. It's one of those books where like the things that are in it that are good are really good, and the things that aren't good, just skip them. You know, neck information, pretty darn good. But I just taught a Bridgman class, And what I realized when I was going through here is the way he draws torsos makes almost no sense. Like, what is going on with this oblique? I don't get it. Like, the oblique just doesn't do that. It's like a sheet that rolls across and kind of connects more along here. It doesn't really do that as far as I know. I've never seen anybody like with a huge gap in the side like that. So I don't know what to make of that, right? So while I was teaching that class, I started realizing partway through, I was like, oh my gosh, these torsos are odd, you know? And so I actually redesigned them a bit. And somewhere in here, in fact, when I did my demo for that class, I just kind of copied his drawings. And then when I got into the critiques, which I haven't photographed yet, so these are all just like in a big clump. But somewhere in the critiques, we got into torsos. See if I can find one here. And I tried to like redesign the Bridgman torso a little bit in a way that at least made sense to me. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to find one. They're in here somewhere. They're like buried down in here. A whole bunch of them. They shouldn't be that hard to find. Arm. They end up on the bottom. Aha. Uh-huh. Hang on, getting closer. There we go. I kind of redesigned that oblique, right? And tried to make it connect more the way it actually does, as far as I know. I mean, there shouldn't be like a weird giant gap in here, right? So I tried to redesign it in a way that sort of wraps around and kind of works more like you would see like a bodybuilder type oblique, you know, and have them all connect together. And so that's, again, that's part of the weird thing about Bridgman is some things, man, he's like the best at. And then other things, you look at it and you're like, I'm not sure entirely what's happening there. There's another one, like a redesigned kind of Bridgman thing. Anyway, sorry you had to see this giant chaotic stack of stuff. I keep meaning to photograph it and I forget. And I haven't had time. Anyway, moving on with this arm, right? So let's go in here and take a look at what's happening here. And again, we get some shadow on here, which is going to kind of cut around this direction just a little bit. If you look really carefully, you can see there's like a little thing like that right in there. It's very subtle. I'm actually playing it up a little bit, but that is the anconeus, right? Little muscle that sits right in here and kind of wraps around and connects up into the head of the humerus. And then we're getting shadow kind of right along here where the flexors are riding, or sorry, extensor is riding along the ulna here. And it's kind of popping up a little bit. A little bit of a hard edge underneath there. Right, and then we get shadow kind of down under here. Pop out this way. Now that I'm looking at this, I feel like this whole shape could be a little bit larger maybe. Right, so again, using anatomy to create those overlaps. Overlaps and to help design our shadows. You know, design those shadow shapes and make them a little bit more dynamic. Have a little bit of a shape right in there, maybe. Not really seeing that in the reference, but I feel like it could use it. So I'm just putting it in there. All right, keep that arm nice and simple. I don't know if we need to get into hands. Again, mostly just for time purposes. Again, I can draw hands, but admittedly, I'm not like the fastest hand person. I love teaching the hands class because then I can just do hand demos and I have a whole bunch of time to work them out. One of my favorite classes to teach actually is hands and feet. All right, so we're picking up a little bit of a shadow shape here along the rib and ab section. This part's kind of cutting in this way. Very soft edge, very rounded forms right in here. Right, so they're going to be super, super soft. And this brings us to an area in the reference that's a little bit ambiguous, right? Like, what the heck is going on right in there? It's not super clear. So I'm going to start with the belly button. And I'm going to come in here and say, well, belly button is roughly around this level. Right, kind of sitting in there maybe like that. And then I'll come in here and try to design around it a little bit. And then we have to decide like how much of this should be shadow and how much of it is more like a dark halftone. And to be honest, it's really hard to tell. So we're going to have to link things together a little bit maybe and kind of invent some stuff really, because again, it's not clear. You know, do we want this shape to just end here and then we have another shape down here? I mean, I don't really know. We do clearly have a shape coming out along this way. And then this follows along the abs here, down here. Right, so this area down here, a little bit easier. Very soft shape. Right, very soft shape along the belly button here where it's rounded. And then a hard edge on the other side. Now we got to decide what to do with that area. That is a tough area. Let's see what happens if we do this. Let's pull this out this way and link this into this shape. So there's a little bit of light right here. And let's see if we can pull this shape kind of up this direction. It's tough, right? Because we're not really seeing her abs necessarily. I mean, this is like fat layered on top of them, you know, which is a very specific body type. And so there needs to be an element of invention, I guess. A little bit like that, but to be honest, I'm not super happy with this. I would have to mess with this a little bit. I think what I would do is redesign this area, right? And keep this really clear, right? Like we have a really clear shadow here. Comes out this way, drops down this direction, connects down into here. Super clear, right? This section, I think we can just kind of keep it a little more ambiguous almost, or subtle, I don't know, however you want to think of it. I want to make it a shape that's a little bit more interesting than what I had. It's not like what I had was like terrible, but I don't know, it wasn't the best. It's a little better. It's at least a little more interesting, and I think that'll make a lot more sense if we kind of make this into a complete shape here. So we either have to stop this here and then start it again down here, or make it a loop all the way around. I kind of like this. I kind of like having it broken up in here a little bit. Right, and then we're kind of connecting that into a shadow over here, right? So then we've got some shadow on her hip. So we know where that ACES point sits, and so we know that that shadow is going to kind of pop back this direction. Again, very, very soft. It's going to come down this way, and then it's kind of connecting back out this way. Right, kind of popping back over a little bit with a harder type edge. And then that brings us to leg anatomy, right? And we're seeing the sartorius kind of run through here, which I drew it really straight. On her, it's a little bit more of a rounded shape because we're picking up more like a rectus femoris type shape out here. Right, and we've got a little bit of light in here. And then shadow again. And then a little bit of a hard edge back behind there. You know, over on this side, we're getting a cast shadow. Right, so we've got oblique coming down, wrapping around. Coming down this way, although to be honest, this got a little bit long. Then we've got a cast shadow kind of wrapping around this way a little bit. And around this way. Pops right in here, kind of connects into a little bit of the adductors maybe. So again, I'm kind of playing that up a little bit, right? Like that's not that obvious in the reference. But you can see where the shadow kind of gets deformed a little bit by it, and I'm just kind of like playing it up. Help make things a little bit more clear. This, typically in this area, we would have a really, really soft edge, but since the compression, we have a lot of compression occurring. It's not going to be as soft because it's causing that form to turn more quickly due to the compression. You know, so you can see a lot of this is logic, right? Like a lot of this isn't just me looking at the reference and saying like, oh, it looks like this. Instead, a lot of this is me thinking it through logically and saying like, well, we've got compression in this area and I know we need to kind of mix up these forms a little bit. And so it's going to get more firm out here and even more firm out here, and it's going to change accordingly. And yeah, I mean, that's the level of thought that we have to put into this stuff. Right, a little bit of shadow out here. Oh, let's see, RF wrote, hey Brian, some people have round shape between their eyebrows. How do you find keystone shape between the eyebrows on those faces? That is a good question, because that is actually something that I had a really hard time with for a long time. And we have one model that we worked with in particular who actually has a rounded shape like that. And it took me a while to figure out how to do that. I'm trying to think if I have any drawings of her right now that I could show you just like in my pad, but I don't think I do, unfortunately. I don't know if I could answer that question right this second. Okay, so we've got a cast shadow from the leg, upper leg down onto this lower leg here. So we're picking up a little bit of shadow. Right here. Right here, and then it just sort of links into this part here. Right, a little bit of a cast shadow down onto that other leg. And then we're picking up another cast shadow onto this foot. And that cast shadow is a little bit more extreme. I don't know, doing something like that. It basically just kind of cuts that part off. And then we're not really seeing the rest of that foot at all. So that leaves us with just this leg, really. I'm trying to think about how to answer the rounded glabella shape question. I can just show you real quick, right? So if we have, say we're drawing a head, right? We're drawing somebody kind of like straight on. Right, here's our head shape. You know, we've got a center line, we've got hairline, brow line, nose line, chin. Right? Normally what we would do is draw something like this for that keystone shape. Right? For someone with a more rounded shape, I would rhythmically kind of link it together a little bit more and figure out, and it depends on the person. It's going to be different on everybody, but I would literally just draw like a very rounded shape in here, you know, and let it be very round, you know, and then maybe their brow kind of wraps around like this. This is a little bit extreme. I mean, I wouldn't drop that low probably, but that's essentially what I would focus on and do. But I know what you mean. I mean, we have a model that we worked with that has a very rounded glabella shape like that. And it took me a long time to figure out how to draw her. You know, and sitting there something like that. That's essentially what I would do. I mean, it's not much different from drawing it the way, you know, I would draw like a non-rounded glabella shape. It's just more round. And then it's just a matter of, you know, identifying the person and their type and trying to modify that to kind of fit whatever they look like, you know, and whatever it needs to look like. Okay, so now we've got a little bit of like rectus femoris here, and I think a little bit of lateralis kind of out here. And that's kind of shooting off this direction here. Which which is a little bit awkward. Again, this doesn't have the best lighting. Like the first few photo shoots that we didn't have good lighting, which was my fault. I didn't set things up quite right. And to be honest, I don't want to explain exactly why, because once you see it, it is really hard to unsee. And you'll notice that most places that sell photo reference and that teach drawing, they set up their lighting this way. And in my opinion, at least, this is not the best way for learning. I mean, maybe some people would disagree, which is fine, but I don't think it's great lighting for learning. Let's see. Celsius says, speaking of Bridgman, I got a Bridgman 5th edition book a while back, and they fixed all the upside down drawings they pointed out. Oh, that's good. Took them a long time. Only took them like 50 years or something to fix that. That's cool. But good. I'm glad they fixed it, because I know that's been a point of contention for a long time in the Bridgman world. But good. And that's good to know. Maybe I should pick up a new book so I'm not always having to point that out all the time. Again, I'm totally simplifying these knee shapes. If you look at what is actually going on here in the reference, it's not this simple. And one more example of the importance of understanding anatomy, because if I didn't know the anatomy reasonably well, simplifying this stuff down would be nearly impossible. David Rodriguez wrote, Brian, have you ever compared your drawing with the reference photo in Photoshop to see how accurate you were? I haven't, and I think is not good for my mental health. No, I have not tried that. No, I don't know. Like, I think if I really took my time and worked everything out, I think I could get it to be pretty accurate at this point. But I don't think it needs to be honest. Like, I think that kind of defeats the purpose of drawing a little bit. You know, like the whole idea of drawing is that it shouldn't be an exact copy. It needs to be good. It needs to look like it is. But like as an artist, our job is to kind of change things and modify things a little bit here and there. And it's tough because when you're first starting out and you're just learning, that's not what you should be doing, right? Because you don't know enough to be able to do that. So when you're first starting out, you're stuck copying for a while, right? Like you can't, obviously, like you can't change things if you don't know them very, very well to begin with. And so you're kind of stuck for a little bit, but eventually you reach a point where you realize, like, you know, you can kind of like exaggerate certain things. You can push edges more. You can lengthen a leg a little bit. Like there's things you can do that will make it look more dynamic and interesting. And in that case, it shouldn't match the reference really. You know, you want it to be a little bit different, but in a way where it's designed intentionally and it looks intentional, you know, and it doesn't look like you just screwed up and drew it wrong. That's the hard part, because believe me, it is easy to have that happen. In fact, I'm kind of doing that right now with this lighting a little bit right in here, right? Like if you look, like the shadow really just runs along this edge. It doesn't actually quite stick out like this. But again, with this lighting, it's not great. I'm trying to make it a little bit more dynamic than it actually is, at least in this area. And the reason for that, again, is because this is not good lighting, really. I don't want to go into why, but unfortunately, we did a number of photo shoots when we first started doing this that had this type of lighting. And I really, it's very deceptive. Like I really felt like I was doing it right. And it turned out I was not doing it right at all. And I started teaching that first like term or two when we started the school, and I was like, man, what is going on with these photos? I cannot, like, it's something's off. And it took me a while to realize what it was. And eventually I realized, oh my gosh, it's the lighting on all these photos is, I wouldn't say it's wrong. I mean, I guess maybe it's a personal preference thing, but it wasn't great. It was bad. And we rescheduled a whole bunch more photo shoots and redid a bunch of them. And unfortunately, like I was saying, like most of the reference you find online has either really complicated lighting, which is cool if you're a really advanced artist. There's nothing wrong with that. Where they have like a lot of like backlight and multiple lights and different colored lights. Like it's really complicated, which that's fine. That serves a purpose once you get more advanced. But for learning purposes, that's not great because that really complicates things. And so for the school, like we're like we're foundation art school. We're like teaching foundational principles here. So we don't want super complex lighting. So the best way to go is like single light source, right? Because then it really simplifies your shapes and makes things correct. But it's not as easy as it sounds. It's not as easy as just putting one light source on there. It has to be positioned like perfectly to get what you want. And what's interesting and what I found is I think part of the reason people don't do it right is because to do it right is a lot of work. Like once I started figuring out how to do it, I realized like I have to reposition the light on almost every photo I take. Maybe every second or third photo, as I work around the model. And it's time consuming and you don't get as many photos, and photo shoots aren't cheap. I mean, you're paying, like $200 or $300 an hour. And, so I think people really are like, oh, we got to get the most out of this. And they don't want to take the time to, adjust the lighting on every single photo because it eats up a bunch of time. But at the same time, the result then is not ideal. And there's a specific thing that I'm not going to mention because I don't want you guys to, I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing like other people's reference, because whatever. I mean, if that's the way they like it, they should do it that way. That's totally fine. But there is a very specific way that I want my reference and lighting to look, and this actually is not it. This is actually from one of our earlier photo shoots where it was kind of messed up. Sorry, I know I just said I wasn't going to get into the hand, but apparently I cannot help myself. Notice when it comes to hands, being really careful here to stick with those basic shapes first, right? Notice I came in here and I worked out a block, right? Basic shapes are critical. First thing I drew, block for the palm and like this section of the hand, right? And made sure that was positioned in a way that made sense. And then I'm going to come in here and attach all these other fingers to it. And then from there, we mostly just have to worry about length and width. kind of getting the gesture correct. Again, another example of not really drawing this the way it is in the reference necessarily. You know, if I was teaching the hands class, I would be way more careful with that. For something like this, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to look cool. Although this isn't looking as cool as I hoped it would. I don't know. I'll have to go in there and work on it later. It looks a little bit weird. Partly it looks weird because we don't have the shadow in here, right? So like her fingers, these two are actually up off of her body. But right now we don't have the context for that. You know, like right now there's nothing telling us that that's happening, so they just look odd. And obviously that's not great. We don't want them to look odd. We want them to look awesome. Little knuckle indications in there. But watch, if we put that shadow in there then, it's kind of wrapping around this way. This way. Right, this one's kind of coming back up under here. And suddenly it sort of tells us like, oh, wait a minute, okay, that finger is raised up off of her body. You know, then we get a little bit of shadow up under here. Another shadow up under here, which connects over to this one. But this got a little bit sloppy. Sloppy, and it looks a little bit weird. Looks like I gave her like little sausage fingers. Okay, I'm gonna stop messing with this. We're out of time anyway. Better. That middle finger needed to be bigger. Anyway, this is pretty much it. I think we can go ahead and stop. It's been a long time. Every time I do one of these, I tell myself, I'm not going to make it as long. And then I make it really long. I always think like, I'm going to keep it under 2 hours and stop right there. But no, not today. Mario Chavez says, this was great, Brian. Hope to catch another one. That's cool. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I certainly like doing these. I wish I drew a better hand, but it's mostly just this one finger that looks weird. And honestly, what's weird about it is that it's popping up off of her body. I might just redesign it entirely so her hand's actually grabbing onto there. I think that'll make a lot more sense. Because just, I don't know, it just seems odd. Her fingers are like kind of all over the place. So I feel like I might just redo these two and change them a bit because they kind of look that way in the reference, right? It's one of those problems where like I drew it and it looks weird and I'm like, gosh, what is going on here? And then I take a look at the reference again and I'm like, wait a minute, this looks kind of weird in the reference too. What if we did something like this instead? Right? Like that starts looking a little bit better and makes a little bit more sense. Which unfortunately now I have eraser marks all over the place, but at least that actually looks like she's, you know, doing something that hands should be doing. Jesse, I don't mind the length of the demos. Great information. That's good to know. To be honest, I don't actually mind the length of the demos. Like, I like doing long demos, and I think they're good for learning purposes. What they're not good for is YouTube algorithm purposes. Because one of the things they look for is like the percentage of the video that's watched, you know? And so like when I go look at all the stats, there's like the amount of time people watched and then the percentage of the video that they watched, which is one of the things they're always looking for. And when I film these really long demos, I get really long watch times. People watch like 20 or 30 minutes on average, which I'm pretty sure is a long time for a YouTube video. But then the videos are so long that it kind of like hurts the stats, right? Because then it's like, yeah, they watched 30 minutes, but the thing was like 3 hours long. So then my percentage of watch time, or like the percentage watched, goes down. So that's, to be honest, that's the only reason I want to shorten them a little bit, is because I think more people will see them if I make them a little bit shorter. That hand looks way better. It was looking really strange before. And then, of course, there's little shadows on the fingers as well. Cool. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I think we'll go ahead and stop. Let's see, just checked out an ebook of the Vanderpool book. Good. Vanderpool book is awesome. I in terms of facial features, that's the thing that I used it for, right? Like every single book, there's so many books out there that people are like, oh, you got to study this book. You got to study this book. In my experience, it's usually true, but no one book is good for everything. Every single one of these artists, these like, you know, even when you go back to like Vanderpool and Bridgman times, you know, and like Loomis and these guys that were like considered like the greats, right? Like Hogarth. Like there's things that each of them are good at and things that each of them aren't that good at, which I don't know, maybe I'm not supposed to say that, but to me, use them for the things that they're good at, you know? Like nobody's good at everything. I have yet to see a single artist that's good at literally every single last thing, although I probably could think of some, but it's pretty rare. And guys like Bridgman, Vanderpool, like they're good at a lot of stuff and they're good for learning stuff. But like Loomis, I don't like, I mean, again, this might be kind of a controversial statement, but I don't like every single last thing that Loomis does. I disagree with some of the things he does. Other things he does are awesome. And I think they should be studied, you know, but don't know. This is just my opinion, I guess. But study the stuff that works well and skip the stuff that doesn't. That's what I would recommend. And for Vanderpool, to me, man, that guy is great at drawing facial features. I mean, one of the best for sure. Study the heck out of it for that. I don't know. I don't want to get into fabrics and stuff right now. But we're out of time. This thing got really long. So let's see. Celsius. Probably find a lot of books on the Internet Archive as well. I know you can find Bridgman books. Yeah, the Internet Archive, interestingly, has some really, really old drawing books that are pretty good. One that I would recommend that we found on there is, what's the guy's name? It's a guy that Bob Watts really studied a lot, or at least he said he did.
Ted Kotsky.
Yeah, Ted Kotsky. I forget how to spell it, but Ted Kotsky is a guy that, you know, if you want to know who Bob Watts, like Jeff's dad, was influenced by, it's that guy, Ted Kotsky. And he used to talk about him in class occasionally, and his drawings are like pencil drawings, and they're awesome, man. They're really cool, but you can't really get his books anymore. They're all out of print, like they're just gone. So like, but we found one in that Internet Archive thing, which was really cool. So I would highly recommend checking out the Ted Kotsky. I think it's just called like Pencil Book or something, I think. But it's really cool.
Isn't that like pencil broadsides or something?
Pencil broadsides. Yeah, there is a couple of them. I think it's both of those actually. They had a couple different ones. There was like pencil broadsides, pencil book, and one of them was like a collection of his two other books kind of combined into one. Also, I'm realizing I just left out a shape right in here as I'm doing this. There's a little bit of light right in here. Kind of like right in there, there's a little bit of light. Yeah, but Ted Kotsky, yeah, Devin just wrote it. Ted Kotsky, that guy. I mean, if you want to get into like just simple like pencil rendering and like outdoor sketching and stuff, man, that dude is really good. And what's cool is if you're familiar with Bob Watts' drawings, Robert Watts, whatever you want to call him, you can see the influence for sure. I mean, it's pretty clear once you go look at those Ted Kotsky books and then you go look at Bob's drawings and you're like, oh yeah, clearly he studied this guy a lot when he was young, which is really cool. Okay, sorry, I forgot that little shape right in there. Anyway, this is it. This is the end. So, thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. And I can't reach the button to stop it.
Oh, here, I'll get it.
But this is actually the end this time, for real. Here, I'll let you guys see the whole thing real quick before it ends. There it is, plus a little bit of the cover to our light. Zoom in a little bit. There we go. Cool. Anyway, that's it.